Several hours passed. The dogman was hungry again. Michael and Sophie decided to have lunch too. Sophie approached Calcifer with the frying pan and was just putting the pan on top of the curly green flames when Howl's voice rang out. "Brace yourself, Calcifer! She's found me!" Calcifer sprang upright and almost at once blurred into a dozen burning blue faces, whipping from side to side of the fireplace and pulsing from deep blue almost to white. One moment he had multiple orange eyes, the next rows of starry silver ones. Something swept overhead with a boom. The storm of magic seemed to affect half the things in the room. The skull yattered its jaw so hard that it travelled round in circles. Packets were jumping. Powder was seething in jars. Howl's guitar made out-of-tune twangings, and Calcifer whipped about harder than ever. Michael opened the window. People in the houses opposite were at doors and windows, pointing overhead. Sophie and Michael ran to the broom cupboard, where they seized a velvet cloak each. Sophie got the one that turned its wearer into a red-bearded man. Michael was a horse. They dragged the door open and sped into the street, followed by the dogman. The street was full of people looking upwards. A huge cloud was boiling and twisting just above the chimney tops. Suddenly it tore in two, and one part sped yowling across the roofs and out to sea, and the second went screaming after it. Everyone seemed to think the best view was to be had from the harbour wall. When Sophie reached it, a storm was raging on the sea between the clouds, flinging up great white-topped waves. Among the grinding of ships at their moorings, Sophie heard a great deal of screaming. It was coming from a number of wet, slithery-looking ladies with flying green-brown hair, who were dragging themselves up onto the harbour wall, holding long, wet arms out to more screaming ladies, tossing in the waves. Every one of them had a fishtail instead of legs. "The mermaids from the curse," said Sophie. She looked up at the two clouds. Howl was kneeling on the left-hand one, staring, typically enough, at the mermaids. On the right-hand one, the witch sprang into being, in a whirl of flame-coloured robe and streaming red hair, her arms raised to invoke further magic. As Howl turned to her, her arms came down, and Howl's cloud erupted into a fountain of rose-coloured flame. But now Howl was on the tossing ship below, leaning against the mainmast. He waved at the witch cheekily, but the second he waved, cloud and witch became a savagely swooping red bird, diving at the ship. Instantly the ship vanished, but the diving bird was going too fast to stop. It plunged into the sea with a huge splash. Everyone on the quayside cheered. "I reckon they must have done for one another," said people as they moved away to jobs left half done. Sophie and Michael turned slowly back into Port Haven. Only the dogman seemed happy. He sauntered beside them so friskily that Sophie was sure he thought Howl was done for. When they turned into the street where Howl's house was, a stray cat was crossing the road. The dogman uttered a joyful bark and galloped after it, right to the castle doorstep. There it turned and glared. "Now, get off," it said. "It's Howl!" shouted Michael. Sophie opened the door and the cat crawled over to the hearth, where Calcifer was down to the merest blue flicker. With an effort, it got its front paws up on the chair seat. There it grew rather slowly into Howl, bent double. "Did you kill the witch?" asked Michael, taking off his cloak and becoming himself too. "No," said Howl. "Sophie, for pity's sake, take off that horrible red beard and find the bottle of brandy in the closet." Sophie took off her cloak and found the brandy and a glass. Howl drank one glass off as if it were water. Then he poured out a second glass and dripped it carefully on Calcifer. Calcifer flared and sizzled and seemed to revive a little. Howl poured a third glass and hauled himself to his feet. "Look sharp, Michael. The witch knows we're in Port Haven. We're going to have to move the castle and the Kingsbury entrance now. I'll also have to transfer Calcifer to the house that goes with that hat shop." Howl set to work. He and Michael dashed about, calling measurements to one another and chalking strange signs in every corner. Sophie and the dogman were pushed aside completely so that Michael could crawl about, chalking a 5-pointed star inside a circle on the floor. "Sophie!" shouted Howl. "Quickly! What are we going to sell in that shop?" "Flowers," said Sophie, thinking of Mrs. Fairfax. "Perfect," said Howl, and hurried over to the door with a pot of paint and a small brush. He dipped the brush into the pot and carefully painted the blue blob yellow. He dipped again. This time the brush came out purple. He painted the green blob with it. At the third dip, the paint was orange, and the orange went over the red blob. Howl didn't touch the black blob. Then he went to bed. Sophie and Michael were tired too. Michael flopped into the chair and fell asleep. Sophie looked at Calcifer sleepily flickering among rosy logs. She thought of Calcifer pulsing almost white. He reminded her of something. "Calcifer," she said, "were you ever a falling star?" Calcifer opened one orange eye. "Of course. As you know, I can talk about that. The contract allows me to." "And Howl caught you?" 5 years ago, said Calcifer, just after he set up as Jenkin the Sorcerer. He chased me in 7-league boots. I was terrified because when you fall, you know you're going to die. When Howl offered to keep me alive, I suggested a contract on the spot. Next morning, when Howl came down, they took everything out of the broom cupboard. Then, when Michael and Howl had knocked a hole in the wall, they shouted for Sophie. Where the wall had been, an archway led to the steps that had always connected the shop and the house. Howl beckoned her to come and look at the shop. The shelves, which had once held hats, had a vase of waxed silk roses. He opened the door into the street, and the same shop bell tinkled that Sophie had heard all her life. She hobbled out into the early morning street. The shop front had been newly painted green and yellow. Curly letters over the window said, H. Jenkins, fresh flowers daily. "And where do the fresh flowers come from?" asked Sophie. "You can't say that and then sell wax roses off hats." "Wait and see," said Howl, leading the way back into the shop. They went through and out into the yard Sophie had known all her life. It was only half the size now, because Howl's yard from the moving castle took up one side of it. They went back inside the castle, and Howl went to the door and turned the knob to purple down. The door opened. Big bushes loaded with flowers drifted gently past. Between the bushes, and purple, red and white flowers, the wet grass was full of smaller flowers, pink ones, pansies, wild phlox, lupins of all colours, orange lilies, irises, and a myriad others. Sophie was delighted. "You see," said Howl, "we can cut flowers by the armload every morning and sell them in Market Chipping with the dew still on them." He pointed southeast. "That's the waste over there. Very hot and barren and full of witch."